Millionaire CEO was mistaken for an IT technician by the new secretary and fell madly in love. Before we begin the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Let's dive into the story together. Alice Evans stepped into Foster Enterprises with a heart full of excitement and a hot cup of coffee in hand. But within 10 minutes, she realized her first morning on the job was going to be anything but smooth. The office was in total chaos. People pounding on keyboards, shouting into phones, a full-blown tech crisis unfolding before her eyes. The server had crashed. Every file had vanished. Panic was spreading like wildfire. Alice, the brand-new executive assistant, suddenly found herself trying to manage what felt like a corporate meltdown. She kept her cool, grabbed the phone to call IT, but all she got was a busy signal. She tried again. Still busy. That's when a sharply dressed man walked into the room. Black tailored suit, polished shoes, calm expression. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not in the middle of a tech disaster. But to Alice, under stress and already on edge, he looked like a technician who showed up late. "Finally, sit down and fix it, now, or leave," she snapped without hesitation. The man raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I don't care who you are," she shot back. "The system's down, the company's on fire, and I don't even know where the bathroom is. Fix it now." Instead of arguing or walking away, the man just gave a small, amused smile. He sat down and started typing calmly. Alice stood beside him, arms crossed, watching every keystroke like a hawk. "You type like my grandpa using a flip phone," she muttered. "Was your grandpa in IT?" he asked, without turning around. "No, but I'm sure he'd move faster." A few minutes later, a soft ding came from the computer. One by one, monitors lit up across the room. Cheers erupted. People clapped. The system was back. Alice blinked in disbelief. "Well, that took long enough," she muttered. "At least you finally did something right." And then the office door flew open. A man in a gray suit rushed in, panting. His eyes locked onto the man Alice had just ordered around. "Mr. Foster, the board is waiting upstairs." Silence. Thick. Frozen. Alice turned slowly, her mind refusing to believe what she just heard. The man she'd barked orders at was Arthur Foster, the CEO, the new boss, the man who ran the entire company. Arthur stood up, calmly adjusted his cufflinks, and glanced at her with a faint smirk. "Appreciate the leadership, Miss Evans. I'll consider hiring more IT staff." Then he walked out, cool, collected, and leaving a trail of stunned silence behind. The entire office stared. Alice didn't move. Her face burned, her palms sweaty, her thoughts a jumbled mess of, "Oh my God!" She had just yelled at the CEO, on her first day. After the chaos of the morning, Alice sat frozen at her desk, praying she could disappear into her chair. Whispers spread across the office like wildfire. "Did she just yell at someone?" "Yeah, the new CEO." "Well, that was short-lived. She's toast." Each minute dragged like an hour. No one dared approach her. Even the office coffee machine had gone eerily silent, as if it too didn't want to get involved. Then came the twist no one saw coming. At exactly 10 a.m., the executive board meeting began. Arthur Foster walked in, completely composed. His tailored suit crisp, his face unreadable, not a hair out of place. He sat at the head of the table, crossed one leg over the other, and opened his laptop with precision. Every senior executive in the room braced themselves. Then, Arthur spoke. "Before we begin," he said in a calm, authoritative tone, "I have an announcement." The room tensed. Outside the slightly cracked door, Alice perked up. She could hear every word. As of today, I'll be working with a new personal assistant, Alice Evans. The silence that followed hit like a thunderclap. A senior director coughed. Someone else dropped a pen. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Arthur continued, his voice laced with subtle amusement. This morning, Miss Evans demonstrated an enthusiastic approach to leadership. He let that hang in the air for just a beat before adding, "And I believe anyone bold enough to shout orders at me without knowing who I am might be exactly the kind of voice I need at my side." Across the table, his longtime executive assistant, who had survived 3 different CEOs, closed her eyes and exhaled, as if sensing a storm on the horizon. "And Arthur?" He leaned back in his chair, glanced toward the door, and allowed the faintest flicker of a smile to cross his lips. Barely noticeable. But Alice saw it. He wasn't mad. He didn't fire her. He promoted her. In a world where power often comes with ego taller than the skyscraper they worked in, Arthur chose curiosity over pride. What did he see in Alice? A young woman who didn't grovel, didn't flatter, and clearly didn't care about titles. Her honesty bordered on reckless, and that made her stand out in a sea of people too afraid to speak their minds. Arthur didn't want a yes woman. He wanted someone bold enough to challenge him, even before knowing who he was. And just like that, Alice, the girl who accidentally roasted the CEO, became his personal assistant. While the office was still processing the shock, Arthur calmly sipped his coffee. And Alice? She sat at her desk, stunned, asking herself, did I just get promoted or thrown into the lion's den? No one had the answer. But one thing was certain. Arthur Foster had found something far more entertaining than spreadsheets, and Alice Evans had just become the center of the game. Arthur Foster didn't smile often, but when he slid the thick black folder across his polished desk, there was a hint of something beneath his calm expression, something that could have been amusement or cruelty. Alice took the folder with both hands, her knuckles white against the leather cover. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the contents. The title alone made her stomach drop. Foster Enterprises Annual Charity Gala, Final Execution Plan. The date, 3 days away. She looked up, blinking once, twice. You want me to organize all this in 72 hours? Arthur leaned back in his chair, folding his hands behind his head with infuriating calm. Exactly. And I don't want to hear about it unless something's on fire, literally. Alice's pulse began to race. This kind of event normally takes weeks to put together. He tilted his head slightly, the same way a chess master might when preparing a checkmate. Then consider this your accelerated training. And with that, he returned to his paperwork. By the time Alice made it back to her desk, the folder already felt like a live grenade in her hands. She laid it open across her workspace. Guest lists, vendor contracts, catering proposals, stage layouts, parking plans, security, dietary restrictions, and a dozen names she'd never heard before but was expected to know. Her phone buzzed. It was the decorator. I'm so sorry, the woman said, her tone far too cheerful for what came next. The city didn't approve our installation permits. We can't do the event. Good luck. Alice stared at the screen, stunned. 1 hour in, and the decor team just ghosted her. She took a deep breath, opened her laptop, and started Googling alternate vendors like her life depended on it. Then the band called. We've been double booked. We'll have to cancel. The head chef emailed. The menu's been rejected due to allergy compliance issues. The hotel manager added, one of your VIPs is allergic to shellfish. Your main dish is lobster. Alice stared at the screen. For a second, the room tilted. But then... She sat up straighter, rolled up her sleeves, and whispered to herself, not today. She barely slept. Her hair was a mess, and she'd lost track of how many espressos she'd consumed. But Alice was now in full battle mode. She called a backup decor firm, 12 Blooms & Co., expensive but willing to do a rush job. "You'll have the flowers, lighting, and tablescape by Friday night," the designer promised, "but it's going to cost you." Alice didn't flinch. "Send me the invoice, and include 2 extra centerpieces, one for the main table and one in case of disaster." She booked a local jazz quartet that owed the hotel a favor. She worked with the chef to completely rework the menu. No shellfish, fully allergen compliant, and still elegant. She printed new menus, coordinated with valet staff, confirmed photographers, and scheduled delivery windows for everything down to the champagne flutes. At 3 a.m., she was at the ballroom with a flashlight, checking table spacing herself. No one told her to do it. No one was watching. But Alice knew someone would notice if she failed. By the time the gala arrived, the ballroom was unrecognizable. Under the soft glow of golden chandeliers, the room shimmered with elegance. White orchids spilled from crystal vases on every table. The carpet was freshly cleaned, the lighting dim but romantic, the jazz band warming up in the corner. Alice stood in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, her dress simple but perfectly tailored, her heels pinched, her head throbbed, but everything, every single detail, was in place. She felt someone watching. She turned slowly and spotted him near the entrance. Arthur Foster stood beneath the arch of the ballroom doors, arms crossed, tuxedo perfectly fitted, expression unreadable. But then, for the briefest moment, his eyes met hers. And he nodded, a small, nearly imperceptible gesture, but it landed like thunder in her chest. She had done it. Just as Alice allowed herself a breath of relief, a waiter ran up to her. "Miss Evans, there's a problem in the kitchen." "Of course there is." She followed him through a side door, heels clicking against the tile, until they burst into the bustling kitchen. The head chef was yelling in French, the sous chef looked ready to cry, and a tray of appetizers had just hit the floor. "What's going on?" she demanded. "The guest with the shellfish allergy?" the assistant whispered. "He just said he's also allergic to pine nuts. The new salad has pesto." Alice closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Then she scanned the room and spotted a tray of untouched smoked salmon. "Make him a plate with this. No pesto, no nuts. Add citrus and greens. Elegant, light, simple, go." The chef gave her a skeptical look, then nodded. In 5 minutes, the dish was out. Disaster avoided. She fixed her hair, reapplied her lipstick, and stepped back into the ballroom as if nothing had happened. Later that evening, Arthur approached her with 2 glasses of champagne. He handed her one without a word. They stood side by side, watching the guests laugh, drink, and network. "You pulled it off," he said finally. Alice turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Was that a compliment?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The way he looked at her, quiet, curious, almost intrigued, said enough. Alice sipped her champagne and looked around at the event she had built from chaos. For the first time in her life, she felt something rare, something powerful. Pride. And Arthur Foster, a man known for his impossible standards, had just watched her rise to meet them. Not with luck, not with help, but with fire. And he was beginning to realize. Alice Evans was just getting started. The morning after the gala, Alice arrived at the office early, her heels echoing in the quiet hallway like a woman who no longer second-guessed her place. Her hair was still damp from a rushed shower, her blazer slightly wrinkled from sleeping in it on the couch. But her eyes? Sharper than ever. Arthur had been watching. Not just from the corners of ballrooms, but through every task, every call, every moment when others would have buckled. And now, it was time to turn up the heat. On her desk sat a new folder, thicker than before. This one wasn't about flowers or music. It was a strategic merger proposal, buried in legalese and riddled with clauses that could either sink or skyrocket the company. There was a post-it on top. Arthur's handwriting. "Let's see what you find." She didn't panic. Not this time. Alice brewed her coffee, pulled her hair into a tight bun, and rolled up her sleeves. Hours passed. The sun shifted. Staff bustled in and out of the glass office beside her. But Alice remained still, cross-legged in her chair, pen tapping the side of her jaw, eyes scanning every paragraph like a hawk dissecting prey. And then she found it. A buried clause that, if triggered, would give the rival company a controlling interest. It was subtle, clever, legal, but absolutely dangerous. The in-house legal team had missed it. Alice didn't gloat. She simply flagged it, marked it in red, and attached a note. Needs renegotiation. Too much leverage given away. That afternoon, Arthur called her in. He didn't mention the clause. He didn't praise her. Instead, he invited her to the boardroom. Inside, the table stretched long under recessed lights, surrounded by suits that had decades of experience and egos to match. Alice sat at Arthur's right, barely acknowledged by the others. Until halfway through a heated discussion on equity division, she quietly cleared her throat. "There's a gap in this revenue assumption," she said, her tone calm but firm. "If this merger goes through as is, we'll be overestimating market share by at least 7%. That means false projections and broken trust." Silence. Someone scoffed. "And you are?" Before Arthur could respond, Alice smiled. "The one who'll keep you out of a courtroom if you listen." It wasn't arrogance. It was clarity, and it landed. Arthur watched her in silence. No grin, no nod. But deep inside, a shift occurred. This woman, once mistaken for a coffee-fetching assistant, was now cutting through corporate deceit like a blade through silk. In the weeks that followed, he handed her more: investment decks, hostile takeover counter-strategies, high-stakes acquisition reports. She met every challenge with tenacity and a growing edge of quiet authority. One scene. It's late at night. Most lights in the building have dimmed. But in Arthur's private office, a sliver of light leaks from the crack beneath the door. Inside, Alice is alone, sitting at the long conference table, surrounded by papers. She's barefoot now, her pumps abandoned beside her chair. A half-eaten sandwich lies forgotten beside her laptop. The only sound is the soft scratch of her pen, and the occasional sigh. Arthur stands in the hallway, unseen by her, just watching. Not as a CEO sizing up an employee, but as a man realizing something he hadn't expected. He trusts her. By now the dynamic between them had changed, unspoken, but undeniable. The lines on the chessboard had blurred. Alice wasn't being tested anymore. She was playing the game, sometimes even better than him. And while Arthur still handed her tasks without fanfare, without praise, he no longer double-checked her work. She had earned that, not with charm, not with luck. The hum of office printers, the clink of coffee cups, the soft tap of keyboards. These had once been the only soundtrack at Foster Enterprises. But lately, something else had crept in. Quieter, sharper. The sound of whispers. It started after that dinner. No official meeting, no calendar invite. Just a quiet evening that Arthur and Alice shared in a discreet corner booth of an upscale Italian restaurant across town. Someone from HR had seen them. Then someone in accounting. And by the time the clock struck 10 the next morning, the rumors had spread like fire licking through dry brush. "She's sleeping with the boss," one intern whispered in the elevator. "Maybe that's why she's still around," another replied, voice low but eyes gleaming. Alice felt it before she heard it. The subtle shift in energy as she walked through the hallway. The way conversations cut off mid-sentence, how shoulders stiffened when she entered the room. Smiles grew thinner. Greetings became fewer. Respect began to blur into speculation. And Arthur? He noticed everything. That morning, he stood at the glass window of his office, overlooking the skyline. His face, as always, was unreadable. But in his hand, he held a memo, short, blunt, and direct. By noon, it was in every inbox across the company. Effective immediately, any employee found spreading personal rumors about colleagues or senior leadership will face formal disciplinary action. Arthur Foster. The message was cold, clinical. But everyone who read it knew this wasn't about policy. It was about Alice. The reaction was instant. Conversations stopped mid-breath. Slack channels went quiet. Even the most outspoken gossip mongers silenced themselves. Arthur had never defended anyone before. Not this way. Not with corporate muscle. But the real story wasn't in the memo. It was in the way Arthur looked at her across the room. The way his gaze lingered just a second too long when she entered. The way Alice, once flustered under his stare, now met it, calm, collected, but with something softer behind her eyes. They said nothing. In meetings, their exchanges remained professional, their words clipped, their tones even. But between every line of dialogue, something deeper simmered. A moment during a boardroom presentation, Arthur passed her a file, and their fingers brushed. Just a second, but long enough. Alice's hand twitched slightly. Arthur didn't flinch, but his jaw clenched ever so subtly. Another moment. Late afternoon, elevator doors closing. Just the two of them inside. Silence stretched between them like a thread pulled too tight. Alice stared ahead, arms folded. Arthur beside her glanced sideways, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You okay?" She nodded, eyes still fixed on the glowing floor numbers. "People talk," she finally said. "Let them." A beat passed. Then Arthur replied, his voice softer than she'd ever heard. "I didn't do it for them." The elevator doors opened. Neither moved. Then, slowly, they stepped out. Together, side by side. Not touching, not speaking, but walking in perfect unison. The office watched, and though no one dared speak it aloud anymore, everyone knew. Something had changed. Arthur Foster, the man with walls built from steel and silence, had cracked. And through that crack, a sliver of warmth had begun to shine. And Alice? She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was seen. The Grand Meridian Hotel had seen its share of opulence, but tonight it pulsed with something different. Beneath towering glass chandeliers and golden-trimmed archways, the annual International Business and Philanthropy Gala was in full bloom. Tuxedos brushed against evening gowns. The scent of vintage cologne mingled with soft floral notes from centerpieces that cost more than a month's rent in Manhattan. Violinists played a waltz that wrapped around the room like silk. And then it happened. The main doors opened, and the chatter began to soften, as if the room itself sensed a shift in gravity. Arthur Foster stepped in, commanding the space without a word. Regal in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his presence alone straightened spines and silenced mid-sentence laughter. The man was a legend. Brilliant, ruthless, untouchable. But tonight, something was different. She walked beside him. Alice, no clipboard, no headset, no protective wall of professionalism. Just her, her gown, a deep shade of midnight, shimmered with every step, simple, elegant, and completely unforgettable. Her shoulders were bare, her dark hair swept into a low chignon that let a few strands fall artfully. Her eyes scanned the room not with fear, but quiet poise. She was not a decoration. She was not just a date. She was present. Whispers followed them like perfume. "Is that her assistant? They arrived together? Arthur Foster doesn't do +1s." A few guests offered polite nods. Others gave long, curious glances. The photographers paused, sensing a story but unsure of the headline. But none looked more intrigued than David Lancaster, Arthur's longtime rival. His silver hair gleamed under the lights, his smile smug as he approached with a flute of Dom Perignon in hand. "Well, this is a surprise," David drawled, his gaze shifting from Arthur to Alice. "I never took you for a man who mixed business with satin." Arthur's face didn't flinch, but his jaw ticked ever so slightly. Before he could speak, Alice gently cut in. Calm, collected. "Mr. Lancaster, I assume your charm was lost in translation. Would you like me to help you rephrase that?" Silence. David blinked, caught off guard, then chuckled awkwardly and walked off. Arthur didn't say a word at first, but as they turned toward the ballroom's interior, a faint smile played at the corners of his lips. She was full of surprises. The night unfolded in a blur of crystal glasses, murmured deals, and polite lies. Arthur led her through groups of investors and board members with ease. Alice spoke when necessary, listened when wise, and observed everything. She was no longer the girl who barked at a stranger on her first day. She was becoming someone even Arthur hadn't anticipated. And yet, beneath it all, something unspoken brewed. Each time their arms brushed, each time their eyes met across a crowd, a tension simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't forbidden. It wasn't even reckless. It was simply real and terrifying. Halfway through the evening, Arthur led her outside onto the rooftop balcony. The city stretched endlessly below, steel and glass glittering under a starlit sky. The air was cool, quiet, far from the whispers, far from the assumptions. Arthur stepped to the edge of the stone railing, his hands braced lightly against the carved marble. He didn't look at her right away. "You know," he began, voice low, roughened by vulnerability. "Every day of my life is scheduled, controlled, clean, but ever since you walked into that office and ordered me to fix the Wi-Fi, I haven't had a single predictable moment." Alice didn't speak. Her breath caught in her throat. Arthur turned to face her then, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "You're the only person who's ever made me feel like I'm not in control," he admitted. "And somehow, I don't hate it." There were no more words after that. Just the sound of the wind, the city humming beneath them, and the space between their bodies drawing closer. He reached for her hand, not to pull, not to possess, but simply to touch. And when she didn't pull away, he stepped closer. Their faces were inches apart. The warmth of his breath brushed her cheek. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, every line between them, professional, personal, emotional, faded. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was something far more dangerous, an understanding that from this point forward, nothing would be the same. They stood in silence, suspended between who they were and who they were becoming. Back inside the ballroom, the music swelled. A new piece began. But out here, on this quiet edge of the world, Arthur and Alice had just crossed a line, and neither of them was looking back. It was well past midnight when the gala finally ended, but the tension between Arthur and Alice had only just begun to crest. The black limousine purred softly outside the grand ballroom of the Langston Hotel. Inside, remnants of the evening still lingered. Flutes of champagne half full on polished trays, the muffled hum of jazz spilling faintly from the dining hall, and a dozen high society guests still whispering about the woman who walked in on Arthur Foster's arm. But Arthur and Alice had already stepped away from the glittering chaos, slipping out through the side exit into the cold, quiet night. They didn't speak. The marble courtyard was empty, save for the soft rustle of trees lining the edge and the distant echo of car horns from a nearby boulevard. Above them, the city lights stretched endlessly, flickering like stars caught in glass. Arthur walked slowly, hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored suit, jaw tense. Beside him, Alice matched his pace, her heels clicking softly against stone, each step a measured defiance against the whirlwind of emotion within her. She was trying to stay composed, professional, but inside she was anything but. All night long, there had been something unsaid between them. In every glance across the table, in the way his hand lingered slightly too long on the small of her back, in the way he watched her speak with investors, proud, amused, captivated, and in the way he led her onto the dance floor, saying nothing, letting the music and their breathing say everything. Now, outside in the silence, the weight of those moments pressed in. They reached the waiting car. Arthur stopped. So did she. His driver moved to open the door, but Arthur lifted a hand, barely perceptible, but firm. The driver paused, nodded once, and stepped discreetly away. Alice turned to him then, finally meeting his eyes fully. "What are we doing?" she asked quietly. It was an honest question. Not just about tonight, but everything. The lingering touches, the protective stares, the memo he sent to silence office gossip, the unspoken understanding they'd built over weeks and months. Arthur looked at her, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, with a slow breath, he responded, "I don't know, but I think I stopped being your boss the second I realized I didn't want you to leave." She blinked. That wall she'd spent so long building began to tremble. Something in her broke free. Alice stepped closer. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a decade's worth of restraint, fears, and feelings packed into one moment of bravery. "If I don't do this now, I'll regret it." And then she kissed him. There was no warning, no permission asked. She leaned up, placed one hand gently on his chest, right over his heart, and pressed her lips to his. Time stopped. The wind shifted, brushing softly through her hair as his hands moved instinctively, to her waist, to the nape of her neck, as if anchoring himself to something he never thought he needed. It wasn't a kiss of lust. It wasn't tentative or shy. It was honest. Two people, two equals, finally letting go of roles, titles, fears, and logic. Just being. And Arthur kissed her back, with all the emotion he had buried under layers of control and isolation, with the hunger of a man who had spent years living like a machine, and just now realized what it meant to feel again. When they pulled apart, their foreheads remained close, their breathing uneven, her hands still trembling slightly against his chest. His eyes closed for a moment, then opened, softer than ever before. "Alice," he said hoarsely, "you don't just challenge me, you calm me, you make me want to change." She looked up at him. "That's what scares me," she whispered. "Because this isn't a game anymore, is it?" He shook his head. "No, it never was." They stood there for a long while in silence, the world around them seemingly holding its breath. What began as an accident, as a chaotic misunderstanding in a malfunctioning office, had become something neither of them could control. And now, it was no longer a question of if they crossed the line. They had, and nothing would be the same after this. They had stopped pretending long ago. Whatever it was between Arthur Foster and Alice Morgan, it had moved far beyond the neat labels of CEO and assistant. Their chemistry, once chaotic and full of friction, had evolved into something far more dangerous, far more unshakable. Trust. In the months following the gala and that fateful kiss, something subtle but unmistakable began to shift at Foster Enterprises. At first, it was in the way Arthur no longer attended strategy meetings without Alice by his side. Then it was in the way he began delegating decisions, serious, high-stakes decisions, not to his board, not to his legal team, but to her. Alice, the same woman who once mistook him for the IT guy. Now she sat beside him in conference rooms filled with polished executives, billion-dollar investors, and corporate sharks who had underestimated her from the moment she walked in the door. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words sliced through the room like a scalpel. Precise, unafraid, undeniable. Arthur watched her grow. Not in silence, but in reverence. Where he was methodical, Alice was intuitive. Where he calculated every move 3 steps ahead, she moved with instinct and uncanny emotional intelligence. She could read a room better than any consultant, anticipate a shift in energy before anyone else even noticed the air had changed. Their dynamic became legendary within the company. In the boardroom, they moved as one. Arthur laid out vision, Alice translated it into action. When one paused, the other spoke. When one faltered, the other filled the space, not to rescue, but to reinforce. Late nights in the office became their unspoken ritual, not just burning the midnight oil, but building something, together. Sometimes they worked in quiet sync, screens glowing, the sound of keys and city traffic in the background. Other nights were filled with spirited debates, whiteboards covered in scribbles, coffee gone cold between them. But it wasn't just about work anymore. Between the contracts and crisis meetings were stolen glances, bare fingertips brushing as one handed over a document. The ease of laughter that came more often. The comfort of silence that no longer needed to be broken. Arthur, the man once defined by his control, began to change. He no longer barked orders. He asked opinions. He didn't just trust Alice's ideas, he depended on them. She had earned his confidence, not through charm or seduction, but through an unrelenting commitment to excellence, to truth, and to standing her ground, even when it meant standing against him. And Alice? She too transformed. Gone was the girl who had once trembled outside his office door. In her place stood a woman who didn't just belong in that world. She led in it. Her shoulders no longer carried uncertainty. Her voice no longer shook when she disagreed. She met pressure with grace, power with poise, and Arthur. She met him not as a subordinate, but as an equal. Their connection defied explanation. Were they in love? Yes, but it wasn't just that. They were partners, in every sense of the word. Two people who challenged each other, sharpened each other, saw each other. Their romance wasn't built on fantasy. It was forged in fire, in conflict, in tests, in mistakes, in late-night apologies, in quiet acts of loyalty. They were building an empire. And for the first time, Arthur Foster, cold, brilliant, once untouchable, wasn't doing it alone. He was doing it with Alice. It was a Saturday night. The city shimmered below like a blanket of stars that had fallen to earth. But above all of it, above the traffic, the noise, the expectations, stood the rooftop of Foster Enterprises. Quiet, empty, and waiting. Alice stepped out of the elevator, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor. She'd received only a simple message from Arthur earlier that day. "Come to the rooftop at 8 p.m. No questions." She hadn't known what to expect. Maybe a meeting, maybe a surprise announcement. But not this. The moment the doors opened, her breath caught. Golden string lights hung in gentle loops from the canopy above, casting a warm, intimate glow. A path of rose petals stretched out before her, hundreds, maybe thousands, leading to a space surrounded by lanterns, each flickering like tiny heartbeats. The skyline blazed in the distance, but here, It felt like another world. And in the center of it all stood Arthur. Gone was the suit, the armor he always wore in boardrooms. Tonight, he was in a dark navy shirt, sleeves rolled up, hands nervously folded in front of him. His expression, usually unreadable, was soft, almost vulnerable. Alice walked toward him slowly, heart pounding louder with every step. Arthur took a breath. It shook a little. "I've stood on this rooftop hundreds of times," he said, voice steady but low. "To think, to plan, to be alone. It was my fortress." He looked up, meeting her eyes with a gaze more sincere than she'd ever seen. "But then you walked into my life and wrecked all of that in the best possible way." She smiled through a sting of tears. He wasn't usually a man of many words. But tonight, he didn't hold back. "You challenged me," he continued. "You embarrassed me on your first day, outthought my advisors, saved my reputation more than once, and stood up to me when most people ran away. You saw the man behind the CEO, even when I didn't want to be seen." He stepped closer, reaching gently for her hand. "Alice, before you, I was in control of everything. And then you came, and for the first time, I didn't want control. I just wanted you." And then, without ceremony, without drama, he slowly dropped to one knee. Her breath stopped. He didn't pull out the ring right away. He just looked up at her, eyes filled with quiet desperation and deep, raw love. "I don't know what marriage is supposed to look like when it begins in chaos," he whispered. "But I know I want to build it with you. Will you marry me?" A long silence fell between them. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because emotion had taken hold of her body so completely she could barely move. Tears welled up in her eyes. She had fought so hard to get here, not just in her career, not just through their impossible relationship, but in believing she could be loved this way. And now here he was. Not the CEO, not the untouchable boss, just a man on one knee asking for her heart. She knelt down with him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered the only word that mattered. Yes, he held her close, forehead resting gently against hers. And in that moment, neither of them cared about the company, the board, the gossip, or the future. They had chosen each other. Not out of convenience, not for power, but because somehow, in the middle of every mistake, every battle, every impossible situation, they had become home. And above the skyline, under the glow of city lights and the quiet flicker of lanterns, their story turned a new page. One no longer built on chaos and challenge, but on promise. The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in muted tones of gold, lavender, and rose. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the towering oaks that framed the secluded garden, where lanterns swayed gently above rows of chairs filled with faces smiling through tears. There was no cathedral, no extravagant floral arch, just a private garden, elegant in its simplicity, sacred not because of tradition, but because of what it now symbolized. Arthur Foster stood at the altar, his tie slightly loosened, hands folded in front of him. The man who once built walls so high no one could reach him, now stood wide open beneath the sky, watching as Alice walked slowly toward him. She wasn't dressed like a magazine bride. Her gown was simple, soft, flowing like a whisper of silk. Her hair swept back to reveal eyes that held both fire and gentleness, the same contradiction that had undone Arthur from the very beginning. Every step she took seemed to echo their entire journey. The misunderstandings, the power plays, the nights spent working side by side, the kiss that shattered the rules, the rooftop where he gave her his heart. And now, this. The music faded. The officiant spoke gently, but no one remembered the formalities. What stayed, what settled into the hearts of everyone present, were the vows. Arthur looked at her as if she were still the most unexpected thing to ever happen to him. His voice was low, but steady. "I promise to keep challenging you," he said, a faint smile in his eyes. "To never let us go stagnant. But more than that, I promise to be beside you, not in front of you, in every battle, every doubt, every joy." Alice blinked back tears as her turn came. She took a breath, one deep and full of memory, and smiled. "I promise," she said softly, "to never let you fight alone, to call you out when you run from yourself, and to remind you every day that love isn't weakness. It's the reason we survive." There were no dramatic gasps, no slow clap, just silence, the kind that fills a room when something real happens, the kind that honors the weight of two people choosing each other, eyes wide open. They slipped on rings, not as symbols of perfection, but of resilience, of understanding, of a bond forged in chaos but matured in trust. And then Arthur, ever composed, ever measured, leaned forward and kissed her. It was not passionate or theatrical. It was quiet, reverent. The kiss of a man who once ruled through power, now ruled by love. When they pulled apart, Alice looked up at him with a knowing smile. "No one won?" she whispered. Arthur nodded. "Because we both did." And with that, the garden erupted, not in roaring cheers but in a wave of warm, emotional applause. Laughter and tears mingled. People embraced. Champagne was poured. But Arthur and Alice didn't notice, because for a moment they stood still. Just the two of them, in the eye of a storm that had finally passed. Two people who had once mistaken each other, challenged each other, tested and trusted and changed each other, now bound not by romance alone, but by partnership, respect, and something even stronger than love. Home, and that was how their story began. Sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. Arthur and Alice's journey wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy, complicated, and deeply human. But through mistakes, misunderstandings, and emotional battles, they chose each other. Not because they were perfect, but because they saw the strength in each other's imperfections. This story isn't just about romance. It's about growth, about trust, about what happens when two people stop trying to win and start fighting together. How did this story make you feel? Leave a comment below and rate it on a scale from 1 to 10. How would you score Alice and Arthur's journey? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another moving story. Each one is crafted to truly resonate with you. And if you're still feeling the emotions, click the video on the screen to explore more heartfelt stories, where love, resilience, and humanity shine through.